Can I have a private session? I have with me today Stephen Robbins. You might know him on Twitter as Grumpy Dev. He is one of the co-authors of the Nancy framework, and also the man who has submitted pull requests to more projects on GitHub than any other person alive. And yeah, we're going to look at Nancy and simple data, which put together make up the super duper happy path. And the idea with both of these things is that with a very, very small amount of code, you can achieve an awful lot. And they're very kind of low ceremony, they're not opinionated particularly, they're just really light wrappers around the stuff that you actually want to do. The format of the session is going to be me talking for as long as you can handle it, then we'll have a break for coffee, then a bit more of me talking, and then I want to get everyone hacking away at their own app, maybe pairing if possible, and we'll just kind of be wandering around the room, helping out, pointing out the things that are a bit weird. I've come up with a kind of example app that you can work on with, and I've got a database and everything, if you can't think of any ideas. It's a nice simple app that you can probably get done in a couple of hours. And yeah, just general getting in there and mucking about with it, which is the best way to learn anything. So let's start with Nancy, which is the kind of, you don't really get anywhere. Simple data is great, but you can select data out of the database, you can put data back into the database. If you can't put it on a screen somewhere, somehow, it's not particularly useful. So we'll look at Nancy first. So Nancy is inspired by the Sinatra framework, which is a Ruby framework. Is everyone familiar with it? Okay, so for the people who aren't, Ruby basically became popular because of the Rails framework. And the Rails framework is incredibly opinionated, and it says you're going to be using MVC, and you're going to create models and populate them using our ORM, and they're going to obey this sort of thing, and you're going to be using a relational database and everything. And it's all very heavyweight. And someone else came along and went, I really don't want that. I just want to get a URL and pump some text back. That's all I need to do. So this guy created Sinatra. And Nancy takes the same approach as opposed to ASP.NET MVC, which is obviously the framework du jour. Nancy is incredibly low ceremony. Tiny amount of code will get you up and running with Nancy, and makes you highly productive because you're not faffing about having to maintain things in lots of different places. Best way to demonstrate this is a quick demonstration. So let's go over to here, and we'll start a new Visual Studio instance, because I can start from scratch because it's just that quick. Unlike my MacBook. Seriously? I've been in and out of Visual Studio all morning. It hasn't loaded user settings once. Okay. So once this finally catches up with me, my wife says if Simple Data wasn't open source, I could have a new laptop, but don't want to sign into Team Foundation server. So I'm going to create an empty ASP.NET web application, which isn't something you do very often, but it's the easiest way to get up and running with Nancy, although we will look at some other ways of getting up and running with it soon. And we'll call this Hello Nancy. Okay, so all an empty ASP.NET web application has is a web.config file and all the references that it needs to talk to the ASP.NET subsystem. And the web.config file at this point is basically empty. Lovely .NET 4 web.configs. Do you remember the 3. Anyone still on 3.5? Because everything just ended up in the ASP.NET web config, and then when 4 came out and IIS 7.5, they just dumped it further up the food chain. because it was always the same. So that's what we get when we start off. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to NuGet using the package manager console because we're hardcore command line people. And we are going to say install package Nancy, and then we're going to go straight in and do the hosting.asp.net package. And that's going to go off over the Skills Matter Wi-Fi and talk to the NuGet servers. And if it doesn't, I have a local cache so that it will still work. Good grief.
Are you still doing one downstairs? I was switch wireless access points.
Oh. Yep, I could do that. Although once you've started this, you can't stop it. There we go. Right. I will switch over. Okay, so you see that went off and found the core Nancy package, and it's done things to the web.config. So let's take a look at what it's done to the web.config. It's basically automatically added in for us some HTTP handlers in the system.web that says Nancy is going to cope with all the verbs, and added in some stuff to system.webserver to hook them up in there as well, because nothing says .NET like having to put the same piece of configuration in 2 bits of XML. So that's all done for us. Now if I run this, any incoming requests will go straight to Nancy. But nothing's there to handle them at the moment. So we need to add in something to actually deal with those incoming requests. So we're just going to add a perfectly ordinary class, and we'll call this hello, like that. And we'll take that backslash out because it's upsetting everything. Okay, so we have a class hello. To make this a Nancy module, we derive from Nancy module, which is nice and easy. So Nancy has modules rather than controllers. And you'll see the difference when I put in the code to actually put something up on the screen. So what we do, we create a constructor, and we're going to do all our configuration, all our setup is going to be done in the constructor of the class. And I'm going to say get slash equals, and then this is actually a func which takes a request object, but I don't care at the moment. And whenever I don't care what the argument to a func is, I use underscore. So when you see me doing that, it's not anything special, it's just a convention that I like. Doesn't draw attention to an unused variable. And then I can just do that, basically say get slash does this. And I can run that. Spins up an ASP.NET development server, goes to slash, and hello world. And that is a Nancy application in 3 lines of code. It would be 1 line of code if C# didn't insist on having classes. You look at the Sinatra, and it is literally just a series of get this, does that, and whatever else. So that is getting up and running with Nancy, okay? Incredibly simple. The MIME type of that is text/text because we just returned a string. You can get into all sorts of clever stuff, and we will do as we go along. So, back to the slides. So yeah, that's all we had to do. So if you take out the fact that we've got to have a namespace and we've got to have a class, you kind of got your constructor. But basically, Nancy boils down to being able to write a web application in 1 line of code and not one that goes off the edge of the screen. Okay? So simple data, the other half of the super duper happy path. Yes, hello. Okay, the question was where can the slides be downloaded? We'll put them, we'll sort somewhere out with Skills Matter. They'll be available on SlideShare as well. Or you can give me a USB stick and I'll copy them across for you. You haven't missed very much? basically, yeah, there you go. It was Nancy's inspired by Sinatra. If you go to sinatrarb.com, you can find out all about that there. Then we did the demo and showed how to install it from NuGet, but that'll happen again over the course of the afternoon. And now we're on to Simple Data. So Simple Data actually came up because of Microsoft.data, which became WebMatrix.data. And I don't know if you remember, there was a bit of a kerfuffle around this time last year when David Fowler from Microsoft posted a blog post where he went, oh, Microsoft.data is really cool, and you can just kind of do a query from a string, and built a string by concatenating in the user ID, and everyone went, oh my God, SQL injection. And so I had a vague idea to try and create a framework that was as easy to use as that, but made it impossible to do a SQL injection attack. And Simple Data is the result. It's got features that have been taken from the Ruby Data Mapper and Active Record frameworks. So what it takes from Data Mapper is the underlying adapter model, which gets it to talk to lots of different things. And what it takes from Active Record is the fact that you just make up method names on the fly, and it makes sense of them at runtime, which we'll see in a second. It's all dynamic, which means you don't get IntelliSense. My justification for that is that you don't get IntelliSense when you're writing SQL code either. And IntelliSense is for wimps. And it's incredibly flexible, and as the afternoon goes on, I'll show you some really quite hairy simple data statements that do map fairly closely to SQL. Yes, and also it talks to lots of underlying database engines, and it talks to other things as well, but we'll talk about that later on too. So, quick demo of Simple Data. So I'm going to switch, I'm going to start a new project again. I've got way too many menus at the top of my screen. Okay, so we're just going to do a console application at this point, and we'll call it Hello Simple Data. And I go to Package Manager Console and go to my local cache, which is just a folder on my machine that's got all the packages in it. And I'm going to do install package simple.data.sql server. And that's going to all run locally this time. And so that's installed 3 packages. It's installed the SQL Server provider, which is a provider for the ADO adapter, so it's installed the ADO package, and the ADO adapter is an adapter which is used by the core, so it's installed the core package. And if you said simple.data.mysql, it would install 2 of the same packages and then the MySQL adapter, the MySQL provider as well. So once I've done that, I can just quickly remind myself what I called the database, and then I can shrink that down again. So I can say var db equals database dot open connection and put in a standard ADO.NET connection string. Okay, so I've got a database variable now, which is a bit like the context that you would get from Entity Framework or Link to SQL or something like that. But if we look at var, you can see that that's a dynamic type. So at this point, I can type db.hello.findById1. Helps to assign it to something. And then I can just do a console.writeLine hello.greeting hello.subject and run that. No, that's not what I want. Does anyone know how to get that to go away? You are currently in an unknown...
Presumably it must be on the bottom, so it's going to kill it. And they're running after the little lights on track. Or you can just go to the system and it's got killed. Got that. You go to force quit.
It's not in there. Go away. This is brilliant. This is absolutely fantastic. Yeah, hang on. No, right click, nothing. You don't even show up as a thing. Right, let's just put it down there. Right out of the way. Oh, this is the last time I'm getting a MacBook. Right, Control F5, not CMD F5. Okay, so that worked. Finally, once I'd got the voiceover to go away. It sat down there panicking now, going, oh, I'm trying to tell you what's happening. So yes. Okay. System menu. Preferences. Universal. There we go. VoiceOver off. Thank you so much, Ian. Right. So this was an incredibly contrived example to get simple data to do hello world, which obviously it's not really designed for. But if we pop back over to the slides, which are here, and take a look at the code in nice big distraction-free mode. So we have database coming back from the open command. Open on its own will just look in your app.config or your web.config and find a default database setting that you can put in there, and that'll just return that back. So if you're only using one database, it's easier to stick it in there, and then it's always the same thing. Only one place to change it, all sorts of goodness. Database is dynamic. So we haven't, this was a brand new application. We haven't generated anything from schema. We haven't dragged tables onto a design surface or any of this sort of stuff. So database doesn't really have a type at this point as far as we're concerned. And it certainly doesn't have a property called hello. And basically what happens is that you say hello and simple data goes, okay, there's something in your database called hello. And then we put find by ID. And the something that's in the database obviously doesn't have a method called find by ID. So simple data tears that apart and says, okay, I understand find by. The rest of it must be a column name. So I'm going to do a select star from hello where ID equals 1. And then that returns back another dynamic object, which equally doesn't have a greeting property or a subject property, but it does have the data that it got back from the database. And so when you try to access those properties, it'll look in its little internal data store and go, yep, I seem to have columns that roughly match those names. So you get the syntax that you would get from something between entity framework contexts and an actual custom written data access layer, because normally what you do with entity framework is you build your context and then you wrap that in a data access layer that adds methods that say things like find by ID or find by email, whereas with simple data you just put in db.hello.findById and it works it out for you. Okay, so everyone used the dynamic features in .NET 4. And so things like expando object is the canonical one where you just have a dynamic expando object and you say set this property to that and it goes, yeah, all right, I now have a property called that. So put the two together with a funky little application. And we'll get something that does some postbacks from a web page and see how quickly and easily we can do that, unless there are any questions, which I should just stop for at this point. Yes? Roughly?
Yeah, you said roughly the same as those field names.
Okay, so if you strip out all the case and any non-alphanumeric characters, then the two strings you have left are what it's looking for. So if you've got a shouty database with user underscore name in big capital letters because you're working with a legacy system from 1992, you can still say Pascal case username in your code. Also, you can use simple data from IronPython or IronRuby to provide connectivity there, and those guys do like to do snake case for all their property names, and it will actually go off and resolve that in kind of the reverse way. So yeah, it's quite good at working out that sort of stuff. The point at which it does crash and burn is that if you have two column names in the same table that only differ by like case or a number of underscores or something, it will get upset, but then again, so should your DBA. Or so should you if it was your DBA who was responsible for that. Okay, I'm going to move this back onto desktop 2. Okay, so we'll start another new application. And we're going to go back to the web, and we're going to do an empty ASP.NET web application, and we're going to call this Graffiti. And we're going to go into Nancy hosting ASP.NET and simple data SQL Server. It does it very quickly after the first time because it's worked out where everything is. And now we're also going to install, what was that? That's an excellent text message. So yes, we're going to start putting some HTML into this now because you can't just keep returning strings back. It doesn't make people happy. So we're going to do install package Nancy.ViewEngines. Now at this point you're kind of going, I wonder what view engines Nancy supports. If you're in Package Manager console, you can hit tab and you'll get a little IntelliSense thing that comes up, and it says I support .liquid, Razor, and Spark. I used to support NHAML, but then the people who made NHAML stopped supporting it, so we did too. Did anyone use NHAML ever? I do Ruby programming as well, and that's where HAML came from, and I didn't like it over there. It's just kind of, why wouldn't you want your HTML to look like HTML? Spent 20 years learning to write HTML. Yeah. But yes, some people absolutely swear by it, but not me. So, we are at this point going to go into our web.config, and we're not going to add a default database, but we are going to add the connection string section. Yes, hello. Did you install the hosting.asp.net? I will defer to my colleague who can probably pop round to your laptop, and just going to go to data source equals dot, an initial catalog equals prognet. Difficult for you to follow along because you don't have this prognet database. Like I say, there is a database for the kind of exercise that I'm planning for later on, which is downloadable and everything. So in here we can put provider name equals system.data.sql client. The point at which that becomes very useful is you can use simple data to write an application that has more than one relational database source behind it. And by putting provider name in and using a named connection, you can actually tell it when it's trying to connect to the database which of those underlying providers it should use. So if you have a multi-database solution, then you can work with it in that way. And then we're just going to put name equals prognet. Okay, and now we're going to go back and we're going to create our module. So we're just going to add a class. Call that graffiti module. A bit more space. I was complaining on Twitter a couple of weeks ago about the amount of real estate that the Visual Studio Chrome takes up when you're doing presentations. Scott Hanselman said, try pressing Shift, Alt and Enter. So much better. It's the Mac bar at the top, it doesn't help. So public class graffiti module, which derives from Nancy module. And then we're going to put in our constructor. And we're going to say get slash equals. And now we want to return a view. So we're going to create a view using Razor. And we need a way to pass that view back in through Nancy. So we do that using another dictionary. And Stephen can explain why it's a dictionary, not a method call. There you go. And Andreas Hackinson is the guy who actually started Nancy. And again, I don't think he was expecting it to take off in quite the way that it has. But yeah, he's the other kind of chief guy. He couldn't make it over from Sweden today, unfortunately. So we're just going to return a view called index. Now, what? I think it would be nice if all three of us were here. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so by convention, Nancy is going to look in a folder called views for its views. And in there we are going to add a new item, and we're just going to create an HTML page and call it index.cshtml. And we're going to change the type to HTML5 because it's 2011. Take that out. And take that out as well, and try and work out how to fix the template. So in here, we are going to put in some code to pull some graffiti out of the database and display that on the screen. So we'll just put an H1 graffiti in here for the time being, and then do a save all on that. Run that up quickly, and we should get that. We won't get that because I'm in the page and Visual Studio doesn't know. So there we go, that's just an empty page coming out. So we created a CS.html file. It does everything that Razor does when you use it in ASP.NET MVC. If anyone here is not familiar with Razor, by the way, when I start getting into that syntax, please do stop me if there's anything that you're kind of going, hang on a minute, that's not like web forms. And I'll clarify anything that you need. Okay. So, yes. You haven't really missed anything, so I'll copy them on for you later on if that's all right. Sorry? You really haven't missed anything on the slides? Oh, you probably weren't here for that. So the last 2 hours of the session are basically going to be everyone kind of just hacking away and writing an application, and we'll be wandering around. So yes, I really don't want to stop the flow of the presentation to copy the slides across for you. If that's okay. So in here we can create a private dynamic DB, and we'll just put database dot open named connection, and then we can just put prognet in there. Makes life slightly easier for us. And then in here, we can put, turn this into a full anonymous method rather than just a lambda, which it was before. And we can say var scrolls equals underscore db dot graffiti dot all. So that's the simple data command just for getting everything back from a table. And then actually on the end of that we can put order by added descending, which tells it to show the most recent ones first. To pass that through to the view, and this is where the idea of having it as a dictionary really starts to look weird because this is a method call. But I'm just going to pass scrolls in there as the view, and then we can go into here and say at for each. So that's Razor. As soon as you type at, the C# compiler kicks in and goes, right, we're doing stuff with C#, and then it'll keep doing C# until the point where it can't make sense of it anymore, and then it'll assume you've finished. So we say for each var scroll in at model, and that's what the whatever data you've passed in as that second parameter comes through here as model. And then we can just do P. So at this point, the C# compiler suspends itself, but it says it's got to come back later on because it's got to pick up that second brace there. And then we're just going to put at scroll.text. So we're getting some red text in here because the Razor compiler and builder isn't hooked up properly, because Visual Studio doesn't understand that you can use Razor outside of MVC. This is something that they're working on. I know the ReSharper guys are working on it, so hopefully these things will stop being red at some point soon. So I'll just run this up and go back to / again. And so that's gone off to the database and found Mark was here, which is the bit that I put in earlier on when I was testing this. So the last thing we need is a way for people to leave more graffiti. And the reason it's graffiti, by the way, is that I don't want to cover authentication yet, so I wanted something where anybody could post anything. And I thought, a toilet wall. So this is a toilet wall written in Nancy and simple data. Okay. So basically, we're going to put a form on, and we're not going to specify an action because we're just going to post back to the same page. So we're just going to specify a method, and we'll set that to post. And then we will just put write something, and we'll have an input type of text and a name of text, and then we'll have an input type equals submit value equals scroll. So that's created a form for us on the page, a very, very basic, unstyled form. No, it hasn't. This is because I haven't turned off caching. So if you're working with Nancy, how can I kill the thing when it's not showing up on my screen? Yeah. Or I could change the name of the page. Okay. All right, I'm going to restart Visual Studio. Sorry. Okay, so let's start another Visual Studio, and we'll put parallels into full screen.
So continuous caching something?
Basically, once the Razor view engine has compiled the view, it's cached in a static dictionary. You can turn that off in debug mode. I just didn't, but we will look at something later on that's got that in there. So if I open Graffiti up again. Now, of course, I'm in full screen mode. I can actually kill the thing. Who thinks I should apply that Windows update? Okay. Yes. 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 Yeah. Basically, in your standard connection string section, you can specify a name. So there we go. We now have a form. So we need to add something to do if that form submit button is clicked. So am I allowed to hand these out? A pack of poker cards to anyone who can guess the word I'm about to type. Almost got him in the head. So, post / equals _ and then we're going to put some funky code in here. So we have a standard request object at this point, much like any web framework you've ever worked with. So we have a request, and that has got a form property, which is the data that's come back from the form. And at this point, we're back into dynamic again. So this is going to dynamically resolve things. So in there, I can put text, and that will get that field back from the submitted form. So in here, I can just say db.graffiti.insert text request.form.text. And I don't have to worry about SQL injection because under the covers this is all being done through ADO.NET parameters and everything. It's all completely safe. So there's nothing that they can put into that text field that's going to cause me a problem with this here. And then having done that, I can just return new redirect response back to / and that will take us back to the get. If I run that, the form hasn't changed. I will kill it just in case. Okay. Click that. And there we go. Okay. So, I say so a lot. Basically, every bit in between there's a so, and it drives people mad when I'm doing a 1 hour talk. In 3.5 hours, they're just going to want to kill me. That, which fits on a screen, you know, there's this idea that you should never have a method that is larger than a screen. So, and if you've got a method that's longer than a screen, then you need to break it down. And if you've got a method that's 2,000 lines, by the way, then that's probably about 3 classes, actually. But that's a different talk. We here have a functioning application with an abstraction away from the database and an abstraction away from handling HTTP, and the entire application fits on one screen. And this is kind of why we call it the super duper happy path, because you just dive in there, write very little code, and it all works. And we've got funky little like form.text, so we're not messing about with dictionaries or saying get field value or any of that kind of thing. Simple data is able to work out what order by added descending means, because it knows order by and it knows descending, so it just takes what's in the middle. We've got a view, we can pass a model into it. Actually, what's being passed in there is effectively the simple data equivalent of a link IEnumerable. So it's only at the point where you're in the CS.html file and it starts iterating over it, that's the point at which your database connection is opened, all the data is pulled out, and then your database connection is closed again. And it handles all that for you. It's got some stuff in there to make sure that your database connections stay open for the minimum possible time, but also that you get the first result back as soon as that's available, and then it does background caching of everything else and kind of spins it through. Interesting side effect with very large result sets, but very large result sets are bad anyway. So that's our simple application. So we need to get into more complicated stuff, because there are very few websites you're going to want to put on the internet where people can submit data without knowing who those people are. It's particularly helpful when they come back and they want that data back again, if you can work out that it belongs to them. So Nancy supports two forms of authentication. It supports basic authentication because it's a thing that you expect to be supported, but that's that thing where people come along in a browser and they get the little window that pops up and you always think, that's a bit crap. I remember that from before the internet. So we have forms authentication, which is the preferred way of doing this. And forms authentication, you can create a database and have a users table and do a register thing and all this sort of stuff. But also the forms authentication framework is very, very lightweight, very unopinionated. You don't have to create a membership provider or any of the stuff that you do when you're creating an ASP.NET application. It'll just go, I've got, I need you to say this person's authenticated. You do whatever is necessary in order to handle that, and then say, okay, now he's authenticated. And then on every subsequent pass through, Nancy will just go, this is your current user, and ask you how to turn the user ID into the full user object. So we'll take a quick look at how you do authentication. I'm not going to sit down and type for this bit because it would take too long. But this introduces the other primary class in Nancy, which is a default bootstrapper, okay? And that, or your application bootstrapper. So this is the equivalent of application underscore start. The really nice thing about this one is that it doesn't trigger ReSharper's incorrectly named method thing. And so we have an initialize internal. This is called when the application is starting up. If you have multiple bootstrappers, they will run in a non-deterministic order. So you can break things out into different bootstrappers, but you can't have something in one bootstrapper that depends on another bootstrapper having been run already. Okay? Really, you should only have one, but there are occasionally you might have like someone might write an extension that has its own bootstrapper with it, and then that would get picked up as well. So if you had a library that needed something done initialize, then that could be hooked up there. So we have to defer back to the internal code there. And then we just say forms authentication .enable. On the previous slide, see that says nancy.authentication.forms, so that's another NuGet package. One of the really nice things about Nancy, in my opinion, and this isn't, I didn't write it, so I'm not being big-headed. You install Nancy, and it doesn't do very much at all, because it doesn't have any opinions about what you should be using, how you should be doing authentication, what view engine you should be using, what hosting platform you should be using. And so all these bits and pieces that actually hook it up to everything are installable as separate packages, which is fantastic. Now we live in a post-NuGet world, because you install the bits that you need and you don't have the bits that you don't. So we're going to say forms authentication.enable, basically passing in the bootstrapper so that the forms authentication system can pick up the bits and pieces that it needs from here. We're going to say this is where you have to send the user to if they're not authenticated. And I have created an implementation of HowToUseNan mapper somewhere in this application, and you can get that. The default IOC container for Nancy is TinyIOC, which Stephen also wrote. And TinyIOC has a very nice feature where if there's only one implementation of an interface in your entire application, it'll just use that. You don't have to tell it. So we are just, I'm not going to show the implementation here. Username mapper just has one method. Nancy will always deal with your user ID as a GUID. It is the best way of dealing with user IDs in any kind of web system, because you don't want to be letting people just go, I'll randomly try putting in 456 and see whose user details I come up with. And Nancy just wants a way that we can tell them the user's name from the GUID. So you can have stored this any way you want to, dealt with it any way you want to. You might just pull it back from Twitter or whatever you want to do. Then, to secure a module, you have your Nancy module as before, and you just put this .requires authentication at the start. And that says to Nancy that every single URL, every single endpoint that you're defining in the rest of this class has to be authenticated. They can't access it without. So if Nancy comes along, tries to go to one of those and can't, it will go to, in this case, ~/login as its resolution for that. And then underneath, you just carry on as before. You'll also notice that we have base/secure, and this provides the base path for all the URLs within this class. So that passes that back up to the base constructor of the module, and that adds that into the routing table. So actually this get here is /secure/, because we pass that up there. So if you're writing a RESTful system and you've got a customers module and an orders module and a shopping cart module, that's a nice way to deal with all those URLs in one neat place. And then the post on the login, just some code here that's going off to whatever user service you might have to authenticate it. We get that back. If it doesn't work, we just redirect back to the login, and in this implementation we're going to put in a query string that says this was the username they entered, so you can put that back into the form. But assuming it does work, you call this .login and redirect, which is an extension method on Nancy module that the forms authentication library adds, and that basically says here's the GUID that identifies this user, and you also have an expiry, which is how long the cookie lasts for. So that might be 10 minutes, it might be an hour, it might be infinite if you want them to always be logged in on that machine. And that's it, basically. That's how you do forms authentication, which we will include in the exercise app later on, so everyone will get a chance to play through that, and we'll be able to wander around and make sure everyone's got the hang of it properly. Okay? So everything that we've looked at so far has been dynamic, and we haven't defined any classes at all anywhere. And actually, for a lot of applications, that works. And you know, the Ruby guys and the Python guys and the JavaScript guys write all their applications without necessarily working with any static types at all. But at the same time, it can be quite nice to have static types every now and then. Nice to kind of pull back and get some IntelliSense every now and then. So we do have a solution to this in Nancy and Simple Data. I'll show you Nancy's way of doing it. actually, I think I can probably pull it into here. Shift-Alt-Enter. Right, so if I create a class, class graffiti prop string text prop date time added. No, I'm just going to do text. Okay, so at this point, I can actually say IEnumerable of graffiti scrolls equals db dot whatever, and run that. Oh no, that's dot cast graffiti. Forgot that bit. Yes, it does. Hang on. Let's try it this way. Why is that not working? Oh yeah, that's not that.
The other day, we went with our dynamic REST library, and I had to basically, I kind of turned off basically breaking for exceptions and turned back on again. It seems to feel better about that, but I don't know quite what I did. But it suddenly started throwing runtime behind your exceptions, basically.
Okay.
I don't think it doesn't like it in numbers and types.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna stop messing about with that. It does work, I promise. So we're just going to go back to var for that. Let's make sure that's working. There we go. But in the post, it shouldn't do. Oh, it might be that this is an internal class. Oh yeah. Let's call it scroll then. We'll give it one last try and see if it works. Ready to close it extremely quickly, and it doesn't. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Yay! We got there. So yes, skills matter tutorial presenter can't code for toffee. Okay, so here we're going to say var scroll equals this dot bind, and just bring in the model binding. And then we can use a generic version of this and turn that into a scroll object. And this is how Nancy does model binding, which is a bit simpler than the way ASP.NET MVC does model binding. And so here we now have a strongly typed object. And because we have that, we can actually say db.graffiti.insert scroll. And so we're passing a statically typed object into simple data, and it's going to do some funky reflection-like stuff internally and try and resolve from that instead of from the dynamic things or the name parameters, which it was using previously. Starting to dread pressing F5 now. There we go. So yes, there's that lovely bridge from the dynamic nature of Nancy and simple data, which make them so easy and quick to get started with and so terse in terms of the code that you write, and the strongly typed IntelliSense world where actually most of the apps that you write are going to have a class that comes up that needs to be validated to make sure that this date is before that date and everything else that goes on. So, you know, the majority of large applications you write, you're going to want to work with classes, and so you have that this.bind with a generic type, or you can just say this.bind and specify the type at the start if you are one of those code shops where one of the coding standards is don't use the var keyword. Anyone? No? We all got over it now. Have you seen the fuss the C++ people are making about auto? It's great, they're like 5 years behind us. And the demos of the new Visual Studio C++ thing, they're going, oh, look what it does. And you're just kind of like, that, what, refactoring? Woo. Anyway. So yes, that is model binding and simple data working with a static type there. See? There you go. Oh right, no. This is a funky thing that happens while you're running these bits and pieces. Is that under the covers there are some not implemented exceptions and stuff going on, but they are sort of it's simple data going, can you do this? And the underlying adapter or provider going, no. It means that I can change the core of simple data and other people don't actually have to keep up. So some of the ADO providers are like 2 or 3 versions behind. Once it gets to 1.0, you'll get fewer of those things. But actually, if you look through the trace window, when you're running a WPF application, you get all kinds of exceptions going on all over the place. So yes, don't run this with your debug exceptions set to thrown, but equally don't run Silverlight or WPF or any of the XAML-based stuff with exception thrown, because you'll get the same effect. But yeah, runtime binder exceptions all over the place, because you kind of pass back up to the base thing and it goes, no, I can't do that. And in the course of not doing that, it throws an exception. So yes. So yes, there's the graffiti table, and it has an ID, which is an integer and a text, and it also has added, and those have got default values, so when I don't pass anything in, they get set. So the default for that is getDate. When I did text colon, it's a named parameter that resolved to that column name. Yes, yeah, you can pass that through, and that will override that. Okay. So back to the slides. So there we go. That's the model binding syntax. And you can basically just say this.bind person, and at that point it becomes a proper model. The bind method itself is not dynamic, so once you get past that, you do still have IntelliSense, because one of the things with simple data is even if you put .cast scroll on there, at design time, the compiler still doesn't know what's going on. It's off in a corner sulking, basically, because we've upset it by using dynamic everywhere. So if you get to a point where you say, now I want to get IntelliSense and get all my link goodness back, then you need to actually specify the type of the variable, put a semicolon, and then carry on the line below, and you get all your IntelliSense back. Yes?
Do you not use a lot of extension methods?
Uh,
You can't invoke methods via extension.
And I don't use extension methods in Simple Data for that reason. What I do have is a class that implements every single link extension method internally, including aggregate and to look up and group by and the whole thing. And so if you want to carry on, and it takes in a func of dynamic that returns dynamic and so forth. So if you're happy working without IntelliSense, and to be honest, there is an argument for working with Nancy and Simple Data that says you might as well just go into a text editor. And I have written entire applications in Sublime Text and VicoApp. And Nancy certainly runs on Mono at the moment. So if you're doing development on Mac or on Linux, you can work with that. Simple Data's nearly there. And actually, it's Mono that is stopping it. It doesn't like a couple of the dynamic things that I do. So yes. Does anyone want to break for coffee? Because we're an hour in, so take a break for coffee, and then we'll just talk about some of the logistics around this. I'll go through a slightly more complicated application, and then we'll get you guys hacking away and just do interactive stuff for the rest of the afternoon. Sound good? The NuGet approach, it lets you install the authentication system that you want. It lets you install the view engine system that you want. It also is very agnostic about how you're going to host it, and there are currently 4 hosting options available, and you can download all of these from NuGet. So the simplest one is nancy.hosting.self, and this works when you are writing an application. It could be a console application, it could be a WinForms, a WPF app, and you can include Nancy in it and spin Nancy up as a web server. Classic example of how you might use this is like the uTorrent BitTorrent client. You can leave that running on your machine, and it's actually running a little HTTP server, so you can connect to your machine remotely and tell it to download something, and then when you get home, it's there. So that's nancy.hosting.self. ASP.NET is the one that we've looked at, where it hooks itself up as an HTTP handler. WCF gets it to run inside a WCF service using whatever hosting that WCF service is using, which again could be console, could be a Windows service, could be under IIS, and also OWIN. So anyone heard of OWIN? OWIN is attempting to be a standard. So in the Ruby world, there is something called rack. And in the Python world, there is something called WSGI, because Python people are boring. And in the .NET world, there is OWIN. And basically, there's a chap called Benjamin van der Veen, and he was writing a very lightweight, very performant web server called Kayak, and he wanted a way to hook that up to like Fubu MVC and Nancy and other things. And so he said, if we had something like rack, then we could put that in between a web server and a framework and create a stack. And we wouldn't necessarily care what the web server was or what the framework was. You wouldn't have this tying in thing going on. So there is a standard, and it says you will call a func delegate when you are a web server. You'll sort of call a func delegate, and then that will run, and then it will call another delegate. And it's all based on delegates, so that there doesn't actually have to be an assembly that represents this. If you use interfaces, you need to have the assembly that's got that interface in. If you use delegates, then you can put whatever you want in there. There is a middleware application called Gate, which is available on NuGet, and you can download the code from GitHub, which essentially you put a web server and an application in the same folder and run Gate, and it finds them and hooks them together. So that's really nice, and I highly recommend looking into those if you want something a bit more performant, or you want to run on a machine that doesn't have IIS installed. or you just don't need all the stuff that IIS gives you. Not that there's anything wrong with IIS, it's great and fantastic and enterprise grade, but there are things that go with that.
So it's just worth pointing out that Nancy is trying to profile so you've got a client application that you can get out Nancy in it. Doesn't mean you've got to pull that out before you make it.
Yeah. Obviously the ASP.NET is not client profile. Helps if that's plugged in. So, as a demonstration, and in answer to the questions about the performance of Nancy, this is a completely empty ASP.NET MVC application which has got the standard routing table and one controller with an index method, and by the time it gets to that breakpoint, we are 38 calls into the call stack, not counting the app domain transmission and the lightweight function and the native to managed transition that we've got there. And we've got thunks in there, and Windows methods are hiding in there somewhere. There's all sorts of weirdness going on. So to get to your code takes ASP.NET MVC3 quite a long time. If you run Nancy on top of the Kayak web server using OWin, so with all the goodness of this abstraction layer between the web server and Nancy, you get 12 calls deep before it's got into our func that's going to return that text back. Also, just the code itself is quite a lot simpler. Apart from anything else, in the MVC application, we have to have gone off into global.asax, configured up our routing table, all that sort of stuff. In Nancy, we don't. On the simple data side of things, we have adapters and providers for SQL Server, SQL Compact 4.0, Oracle, MySQL, and SQLite. I wrote the first two. The other three have been written by lovely contributors. The SQLite one supports in-memory databases, which are very useful for BDD type testing. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't have an if debug use SQLite, else use SQL Server or Oracle. At no point anywhere in the code do you have to do anything different to work with one database over another database, and that includes paging. There is also an adapter for MongoDB, which is an incredibly cool NoSQL database that does massively performant things, and I believe Skills Matter run days on NoSQL where you can come to find out about that. And we're working on an OData adapter as well, so you'll actually be able to point simple data at any OData data source, which translates as Netflix. So yes, and more adapters. There's people working on Redis, CouchDB. There's all sorts of things coming out. The syntax remains the same. There are things that some adapters will do that others won't do, but we kind of fill in for that in the application. So we're going to move on to this exercise shortly, but just before we do, I'm going to do a run through just dragging some code on very quickly to an existing application just to show some of the more complex bits and pieces, and then we'll crack on with the exercise. So I wrote an application called Heckle, which is designed, I didn't actually manage to get the production version ready in time for today, but it's designed for people to give a speaker feedback while they're talking, and the speaker can have that open on his iPad or whatever, and it'll just kind of flick through. So those of you who are sat there absolutely busting to insult me but don't want everyone looking at them can just do that through this application. So I really don't. Don't use simple data, he can't code. Okay, so very simple database structure. We've got a session table, we've got a feedback table, and we've got a users table which isn't used in this version. So I can close this down. So in here, I've already got a whole bunch of CSHTML files set up and everything, because you don't want to sit here and watch me draw all the forms out and all this sort of stuff. There's one thing that is worth looking at quickly before we carry on any further, which is static content. So everything we've looked at so far has been returning either strings or rendered Razor views. And obviously you want JavaScript files and CSS files and PNG files and all these things in your application. And you don't want to be having to generate those on the fly. So I wrote a static content module that says my base is /content, and then does a get dot star, which is everything. So you can use regular expressions in the URL path, and you can name those regular expressions using the naming syntax, and then those become rec dot whatever you said within that. So it's extremely flexible on there. And then the static content provider is just something that goes off to the underlying file system and picks things out of the content folder and returns them back down. In this case, it's just some CSS and an emoticon. Okay, so we go back to the main module. Put that into full screen. No, we can't put it into full screen because I need the toolbox at the side. Because I am just going to drag these things on. So in here, I'm just going to say get / to just return a header back on the index page. And then for get session, we're going to put some code in here that shows extracting values from the URL. So here, because we don't need regular expressions, we're just saying the things between the slashes. So this is very much like a standard MVC route in whatever framework you're using. We're going to say there's an event code, then there's a slot, then there's a track, and simple data is going to go off and call db.sessions.findBy event code and slot and track. And it's going to pull that apart and say, okay, well, I'm going to take the ands out at this point, and then I'm going to try and do this with columns called event code, slot, and track. If you have a column name with and in it, it will get very upset. Simple data supports an alternate syntax where you can just say find by and then use named parameters within the query. So if this is something that's going to cause your application to blow up, you can use the named parameter form to work around that. If simple data doesn't find anything, it returns null. If it does find something, it returns the record. And we are just directly going to return HTTP status code .not found, which is actually a response. If we do find something, then we're going to return the session view with the session code on there. So if we go into the views folder and open up that session thing there, and we can see we've got @model title with @model.presenter. For those of you who aren't familiar with Razor, this is where it really starts to shine over the old web form syntax and various other view engines, is that the C# compiler, as it comes through, will see that and say, okay, I can resolve model.title beyond that, I'm going to work with that, comes to this space, decides it can't do anything with the width, so that gets passed through just as text. And then we put another at in to say we're doing stuff here. And further up in the title, you can see we've got heckle at model.presenter. And you can put those at symbols inside attributes in the HTML. You can put them all inside script tags, so you can rewrite or generate script on the fly, do all sorts of cool stuff. So if we run that now, and it's going to go to nextgen/1/1. So that's the shorter version of this talk, which you wish I was giving. And so that's hooked that up there. So it's basically just pulled the URL values out and put them into dynamic code. So we've just passed in. That's the other thing here. We're actually using the request parameter that's passed into this delegate. So we're saying rec.event, rec.slot, and rec.track. And again, we're passing those straight through from the Nancy dynamic objects. Okay, so we need to do something to get the feedback. So come out of full screen, go back to the toolbox, and drag on get feedback. So there, we've got event/slot/track/feedback. So you put that on the end, and this is a JSON endpoint. So we're not returning HTML. We're not taking the browser to a new place. This is to be called from JavaScript. And so here we have quite a fun simple data construct, which is worth spending some time looking at. So we're going to pass the date that's been passed in as in the query string. So where we have request.form for a post, we have request.query for a get. And that gives you access to any values that were passed after the question mark in the query string. Yes, question?
What happens when you change your property in the database?
Rules are ignored. But if you changed your database structure, you would have to go through and change your you would have to go through and change your code accordingly. Yes. The field name, if you change text to description, then you would have to go and find all the places where you've done that in the same way that you would if you were writing SQL in strings or in resources. Or obviously, if you change the name of a property of a column and then regenerate your entity model, all your code breaks anyway because refactoring doesn't happen alongside the entity model. The only thing that's a bit nicer with something like Entity Framework is that the next time you hit F5 after doing that, your code won't compile and it will tell you all the places it's broken. So that's something that simple data doesn't give you, but it does work. How do you?
Do you use the existing data in the database with the old columns?
Here we're doing db.sessions and we're doing query by because we want to do more operations. So we don't want to just find, we want to start a query, and we're creating a simple query object and we're saying, okay, query by event code and slot and track. So at this point we've got select star from sessions where event code equals this and that and the other. And then we put in .feedback, and simple data uses the referential integrity in the database to change this query. So it's now returning the rows from feedback and puts in the join to sessions. So you kind of get that drop-through thing to avoid the select n+1 issue that you get with a lot of ORMs. And then we've put in a where clause, and you can see there that we're actually doing a not an equals comparison. And the way that simple data handles this is that you can use greater than, less than, equal to, all this sort of stuff. You can also do mathematic operations within your query. and it will resolve all that and turn that into SQL or something that the underlying adapter understands at runtime as well. Hello, yes.
Can you get simple data to spit out a query that it would
It always writes the SQL that it's running to the trace every time it executes a command. Yeah. You can get the SQL out off the trace. And then order by time descending. The other thing you can do in that where clause is you can put in pipe and ampersand as operators, and you can put parentheses around things to group them together. So all the precedent stuff that you can do in a SQL where clause, you can represent using the equivalent C# syntax in the simple data query. And that can be as big and long as you like. Okay? Yes? You can, yes. And you can also do, so this is using referential integrity, which exists in the database to get from sessions to feedback, but there is a .join.on, so you can say .join db.feedback .on db.session.id equals db.feedback.session.id. Yes? Yes, yeah. The criteria you can put into that on clause is passed in exactly the same way as the stuff in the where clause. It also supports having. So there's a .having clause, and I very nearly put a group by clause in there, and then I remembered that group by in SQL is pointless because you have to group on every column that's not aggregated, and you can't group on any of the columns that are, so why do we have a group by clause? Answers on a postcard, I will pay a cash prize for an answer to that question. Okay, so that, again, when we get to this point in the code, we have a simple query object that has been constructed and is ready to run. Also, we have a laser button that is F5. Don't use the laser button. I'm going to point at the screen. So yeah, at this point, we effectively have the same as if you'd created a SQL connection and a SQL command and set all the parameters, but you haven't opened the connection yet. It's just sat there waiting to go. And then we're going to return a new JSON response. And because this is dynamic, we don't know what type it is, so we're just going to say object. And then we're going to pass feedbacks in. Somewhere inside the Nancy JSON response code, it's going to work out that this is an IEnumerable of iDictionaries of string, comma, object, and it's going to turn that into JSON. And at the point where it starts reading that data, that's the point at which the query gets executed. So we have this deferred execution, do everything at the last possible moment idea. So that will just return a string formatted as JSON with the MIME type application/JSON or text/JSON. It's the right one. Okay. So now, if I run that, nothing will happen because I haven't put in the script code to actually pass that information back. So let's go back into session.cshtml, and then up here we can see there's a get feedback script. That was just one muck up too far for that guy. He stormed out in disgust. Okay, so get feedback script. You can see why I drag these on rather than trying to type them, can't you? There's no need to say it quite like that. Oh dear. So yes, here we have script, and this nicely demonstrates what I was saying earlier on about being able to put these at things in the Razor syntax anywhere you like. So here we're actually embedding it directly in the JavaScript and putting just event code and slot and track, and those are coming off the model that we pulled back from simple data earlier on. And then we're going to pass the date times and so forth. And then we have this very, very funky thing here where it says feedback template, .template the data, and prepend to our feedback list div. So this is jQuery templates. Has anyone used jQuery templates? They are like the best thing ever. It's what the ASP.NET repeater should have been, and it runs client side. And Microsoft came up with it, and then it's been contributed into the jQuery core, and it is now a fairly standard part of the language. You can certainly rely on it. I don't think it's on Google CDN, but it's certainly on Microsoft's and on the jQuery CDN, so you can get it from there. So we need a template for that to actually work with, which goes down here. So the jQuery template there is working like that. So the type, it's a script tag, but the type of the script is text/x-jQuery-tmpl. And then within that, we have these constructions here, which are string interpolation operators. So as jQuery goes through, it'll say, does the list of objects that I've been given, does each object have a mood property? If it does, then I'll stick that in here. So this just generates a big list without you having to do it server side, and without you actually having to say for each this build some HTML and so forth. So very nice little templating system. The last thing we need to do, and I usually forget this, so bonus, is the first time the page loads, we need to do the first call to that get feedback. And then after that first call, it sets a timeout to call itself again. And so it calls itself every however often it is. Okay? So if you run that now, you can see that it loads that up, and then it's going back and it's calling that get feedback method, isn't it? Hello? I didn't kill Cassini. That'll do it. I don't know. This is your fault, Stephen. No, it's because if I change it to do that, and save and run, that'll force it to restart. There we go. Right, infrastructure problems. So yes, there we go. That's got that feedback back. Lots of intelligent things being typed in there. So the last thing we need is to hook up this post over on this side. The first time I put this live on an actual event, it didn't have any authentication at all, because there you go, that's the timeout calling that again. He said, like it was what he'd planned all along. Let's just... and somebody got heckled through it. So 2 suggestions were made. One, require some kind of identification. So I'm putting Twitter and Facebook on so that people have to identify themselves. And 2, don't call it heckle. So the live version is called Vox Pop. So yes, the last thing we need to do is deal with the post that comes back off that form. So we'll just drag on the post feedback code there. And so there you can see the pulling the session out and doing some validation and then casting things into strings just to make sure that those work properly because we're doing things like is null or white space and so forth because we don't want empty comments going in. And whilst you can put in Mickey Mouse if you want to, I want you to put something in that field. So we're getting into some validation there. And then doing an insert using the named parameters method so that we're all nice and dynamic, and then returning the redirect response basically with the request URL. That's not going to work, is it? Request.path. No. Because mood, the underlying type of mood is a dynamic dictionary value, and the optimization that the C# compiler does with the null coalescing operator uses reference equals to see whether it's null. And if you call reference equals on anything except null, it'll return false. So the null coalescing operator doesn't actually work at this point. But this does. Peculiarly. I only found that out when I was writing that one line of code, so I tried it with a null coalescing operator because it's my favorite C# operator, but yes, it wasn't having it. Oh, so I did. We should probably put a curly brace back down here then, shouldn't we? There we go. And then it'll actually take a second, and the next time it goes round to get that on the timeout, it will pick that up. Yes, I think the page gets cached or something, stops it from picking it up straight away. It'll pop up there shortly. Okay, so that's the kind of a more complete application with some design and CSS and everything in there. That shows how to serve static content out. And I think at this point, I'm going to stop talking. Blessing for everyone. Grab a quick cup of coffee, and then we can start working on the demo app, or the exercise app. We're going to make a soup, unless you can think of your own idea that you want to start working on. If you've got something that you're kind of going, oh, this would be great for this idea that I've had, and you just want to make a start on it with me and Stephen in the room, and kind of get yourself going and then go and carry on afterwards, then that's absolutely fine, and whatever you come up against will help you with it. If you just don't really have any ideas but you want to create something, then I came up with the idea of a to-do app, which has got simple authentication. And if you go to http://bit.ly/prognet-nsd, this being bit.ly, that is case sensitive, you will get a zip file which has got a SQL compact database and an encryption helper.cs class, just because you don't want to be faffing around with salts and stuff. The database schema in that database is at the bottom of the screen there. Install the packages from NuGet and crack on. I'm going to grab a quick cup of coffee and a cigarette, and then I will be back in the room to help out. Any questions before we move on? There's one other URL that may be helpful. Have you got documentation link for? Okay.
So that will disable the view output caching, so you can patch your views and just F5 it and move things a bit quicker. The one thing it doesn't always turn off, which will be fixed, is we also cache what routes are in your modules. So if you run your app and then you add post, and then it doesn't seem to be working, and you get 404s, just kill Cassini and then start it back up again. I wish there was an option in Visual Studio to say always kill Cassini when I press stop, but there isn't. So,
Yeah.
put it back on the slide and I'm going to do it.
There we go.
The Room's tried an implementation of iFood to your project. It will automatically discover that and automatically inject it. You don't have to do any kind of configuration. If you don't like that, or if you're an AutoFact fan or a structure map fan or any of the other major containers, there are other NuGets on NuGet, strangely enough, that provide bootstrappers for all the other containers. So if you look at the bootstrapper class, if you derive from it and just type override and space, there's a certain number of things that you can override. You've got configure application container, which happens once when the application starts up, so you can shove all your types in the container there. There's then configure request container, which is request scoped dependencies. So if you've got, I don't know, say an nhibernate session that you want to stick in, just lives for the request, then gets disposed at the end of it, that's where you put that. Then you've got sort of the initialized internal, which is, you can do container rated stuff, but that's more where you tell Nancy the way you want to configure it. And then there's a bunch of other properties. So Nancy is by default configured to do everything automatically, and you shouldn't really hit any barriers in case you just get up and are just seeing types and code and off you go. But if you don't like the module discovery, you don't like that, you don't like the fav icon or anything like that, everything virtually is configured via the bootstrapper, and you can pull out any individual component in Nancy and replace it with your own. You can put your own route matching in. The entire thing is just composed at runtime. Everything is about a bazillion classes and interfaces in there. You can override any of them. And virtually all of it has got comments, amazingly. So
it's amazing what you can discover just by going to GitHub and either reading the code for the bit that you're trying to work with, because most of the code is not that complicated.
Whereas every time we add a feature, we try and either add a demonstration of the feature to the hosting ASP.NET project on GitHub, or we add a new project. So if you want to know how to use forms authentication, there's a forms authentication sample application on there, which you can just have a look at. There's about 6 lines of code. So,
okay.
Knock yourselves out. Not literally.
This is my reference implementation of the to-do application. So it's got an index page which sweaty fingers. Nobody wants to know that, Mark. Shut up. So yes, this. I said to Stephen, "Do you want to style the pages?" And he went, "Yeah, I'll do it." So yes, this is the unsecured page, the landing page that you go on to. That just has a link that takes you to my to-dos. This is secured using that this.requires authentication method that we added in the module earlier on. So everything within the to-do module is secured. So it's redirected us to the login page, and you can see it's put the return URL on there for us magically so it knows where it's going back to. If you want to just work without having to register, there is a register link and that works as well, but you can use mark@markrendell.net and password, which is the password I use for all my online banking, my Google account, my Twitter account. And then you click login. Yeah, go on then. And that takes you to this page, and we could probably zoom out a bit if I could remember how to do that. Get fixed, you over-engineered. What have you done?
Just type in the bottom, press enter.
So yes, the CSS appears to have gone slightly weird. But yeah, so we're just basically, most recent things are shown first. No, oldest things are shown first. You've got to mark complete and mark incomplete and so forth at the side there. And prepare for ProgNet 11. Because let's face it, I clearly haven't. I haven't slept this week. That's why it's going so spectacularly spectacular. So yes, there you can see. Prepare for ProgNet 11 added at 4 o'clock this morning for some reason. Okay, whatever. It's because I haven't. Yeah, I've used lowercase hh instead of uppercase hh. So yeah, there you go. And that is not your style sheet. That's mine. And a logout link at the bottom there. And when you do logout, it's logout and redirect. Yeah. So much like login, redirect. It does look like that. Actually, yeah. Let's leave that there. That's what I was doing at 4 o'clock this morning. Certainly wasn't asleep or in a drunken haze. Okay. So that's kind of what we're aiming for. If you want to come and crib off this code at any point, or you want me to just copy it onto USB stick for you, I haven't put all the code up anywhere because I do think it's better if people kind of work through it from scratch. But the two bits that are a pain in the arse to create, which is encryption and the database itself, you can download from that link. And I'll leave this on the screen so you've got the database schema there, because you're not going to get any IntelliSense, because it's for wimps. Okay, like I say, I'm going to grab a coffee and a cigarette, but I will be back in about 10 minutes. All right? Everyone happy?
One question.
Yes.
Have you considered implementing integration with to like an HBlock or something?
A what?
An HBlock, you know, an hibernated file